The afternoon sun was warm, but the city air felt heavy. People moved quickly, their eyes fixed on their phones or the road ahead. At the crowded bus stop, an elderly woman stood quietly, holding a small handbag close to her chest. Her gray hair was neatly tied back, and her hands trembled a little as she waited. She looked tired, as if the day had already taken too much out of her. But there was a calmness in her eyes, a kind of quiet strength that comes from a life full of lessons. When the bus arrived, it was already half full. The woman waited for a few people to step off before she climbed aboard. Her steps were slow, careful, and shaky. The driver gave her a quick glance but didn't say much. She took a seat near the front, resting her bag on her lap, breathing softly. The sound of the engine and the chatter of passengers filled the air. The bus rolled through busy streets, passing markets, shops, and people rushing through their day. She looked out the window, watching the city move by, her mind lost somewhere else. Maybe she was thinking about her home, or maybe about her son who had promised to visit her soon. She had just come from a hospital appointment and her legs hurt a little, but she felt relieved that everything had gone well. She smiled faintly, whispering a quiet prayer of thanks. A few stops later, the bus became even more crowded. People stood shoulder to shoulder, holding on to the metal bars. A group of young passengers chatted loudly at the back, while an old man next to her dozed off. Everything seemed normal until the bus stopped again, and two uniformed police officers stepped inside. They started checking tickets. It was a routine inspection. The driver nodded to them and they began moving down the aisle, asking each passenger to show their pass or receipt. Most people showed theirs quickly. The officers were polite but firm, not wasting time. When they reached the elderly woman, she smiled softly and began to search through her bag. "Just a second, dear," she said in a gentle voice, her hand shaking as she opened the zipper. She searched one pocket, then another. Her fingers fumbled with a few papers, a small medicine bottle, and an old photo. The ticket was nowhere to be found. Her eyes widened slightly. She looked up at the officer with concern. "I had it when I got on," she said quietly. "Maybe it fell inside the hospital. I can pay again when we stop." "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." The officer sighed. He wasn't rude, but his tone carried impatience. "Ma'am, without a ticket you can't stay on the bus." "That's the rule. Please," she replied softly. "I'm going home. My son will pay. I just need to reach there." A few passengers glanced over. Some felt sympathy, others didn't care. The bus grew quieter. The officer looked at his partner, then back at her. "I understand, ma'am, but I still have to follow the procedure. Can you come with us?" Her lips trembled. She looked around, hoping someone would help. No one said a word. The driver watched through the mirror but stayed silent. One of the young passengers whispered something, and a few people chuckled softly. The sound pierced her heart more than the officer's words. She tried again, gently. "Please, I'm not lying. I just lost the ticket. You can check my bag if you want. I don't have bad intentions." The officer nodded but didn't move. His voice grew firmer. "Ma'am, please stand up." Slowly, the elderly woman got to her feet. Her knees wobbled a little as she held onto the seat for balance. She apologized again, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause a problem." The bus stopped and the officers guided her toward the door. The crowd watched silently. Some passengers looked away, uncomfortable, while others lifted their phones to record the scene. Her eyes filled with tears, but she tried not to cry. She stepped off the bus, her small frame looking even smaller on the busy sidewalk. The officers stood beside her, still speaking in low voices. Inside the bus, one young man muttered, "That's not right." "She's old." "They could have let her go." Another replied, "Rules are rules." The argument faded quickly as the bus driver closed the doors and drove away. Outside, the woman stood quietly. She didn't shout or complain. She simply lowered her head, gripping her handbag tightly. Her heart hurt not because of the ticket, but because of the humiliation. She had never imagined being treated that way in front of strangers. The younger officer, noticing her distress, spoke more gently now. "Do you have someone we can call, ma'am?" "No, dear," she whispered. "I live close. I'll walk." It was a long walk, but she didn't want any more attention. She took slow steps, her body aching with each movement. The officers watched her leave before heading back to their patrol car. They didn't think much about it. To them, it was just another small incident in a long day, but for her it was something she couldn't forget. As she walked down the street, people passed by. busy with their own lives. A few looked at her curiously, recognizing her from the bus. She tried not to meet their eyes. The video, recorded by one of the passengers, had already been uploaded online. Within minutes, it began to spread. Comments poured in, some angry, some sad. Many couldn't believe how cold the world had become. Meanwhile, the woman reached her small home at the edge of the city. She lived in a simple apartment, filled with old furniture and framed photos on the walls. She placed her bag on the table, removed her shoes, and sat down heavily on the couch. Her back ached and her eyes burned with unshed tears. For a long time, she just sat there staring at the floor, her mind running through the day's events. She didn't blame the officers. She understood rules, but it hurt that no one had spoken up for her, not even one person. In her day, people helped one another. Now it seemed everyone was too afraid or too busy to care. She sighed, wiping a tear with the corner of her scarf. Then she glanced at a framed photograph on the table, her son in his police uniform, smiling proudly. She smiled faintly through her sadness. He was a good man, respected and kind. She didn't want him to know about what happened. It would only upset him. She whispered softly. He's doing his duty. That's all that matters. But somewhere in the city, her son was finishing a long shift when his phone buzzed with a notification. A friend had sent him a viral video with a message that read, "Isn't this your mother?" He clicked it and his heart stopped. He saw her standing helplessly on the bus, pleading softly, being led off by officers wearing the same uniform he wore with pride. He froze, unable to breathe for a moment. His jaw tightened and anger slowly rose in his chest, not just as a son, but as a man who believed in justice. He couldn't believe that the woman who had taught him compassion and respect was treated that way by people who were supposed to protect the weak. He didn't waste time. He grabbed his jacket, keys, and phone and rushed out. As he drove through the city, his mind was racing. He didn't know whether to be angry or heartbroken. All he knew was that he had to see her, to make sure she was okay. Back in her apartment, the old woman prepared a small cup of tea. The warmth calmed her shaking hands. She looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker. She had lived a long life and seen many hard days. But the world felt colder now. Not because of weather, but because kindness seemed to be disappearing. Outside, a car stopped near her building. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the hallway. Then came a gentle knock on her door. She got up slowly and opened it. Standing there was her son, his face pale and eyes filled with worry. "Mother," he said softly, his voice shaking. She smiled weakly. "You're home early." He didn't answer. He just hugged her tightly, holding her as if afraid she might disappear. She patted his back gently, whispering, "It's all right, my child. Don't worry," but he couldn't calm down. He pulled back, looking into her eyes. "Why didn't you call me? Why didn't you tell me what happened?" She smiled faintly. "Because it's not important. I'm fine." He shook his head, his heart breaking. "It is important. No one should ever treat you like that." She sighed softly. "People forget kindness when they're busy. Maybe they didn't mean harm. Let it go." He couldn't. He knew this wasn't just about her, it was about what his uniform stood for. That night, as she went to rest, he sat silently in the living room, the video still playing on his phone. His mother had always been the reason he became an officer. Tomorrow, he knew, things would change. The city slept, unaware of what was coming. But the story that started with an elderly woman being forced off a bus was about to become something much bigger, a lesson in humanity that no one would forget. The next morning, the city woke up to something unexpected. The video of the elderly woman being forced off the bus had gone viral overnight. It was everywhere, on phones, social media, and even local news websites. People from all walks of life were talking about it. Some were angry at how carelessly she had been treated, while others blamed the system for lacking compassion. The short clip showed her standing helplessly, trying to explain, her voice trembling. That image touched thousands of hearts. At the small apartment, the elderly woman had no idea about any of it. She had slept poorly, her mind still replaying the scene. She tried to push the memory away, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces on the bus. The ones who looked away, the ones who laughed quietly, the ones who recorded. She had lived long enough to know that people could be unkind, but it still hurt deeply. She just wanted to forget it and move on. Her son, however, couldn't forget. The moment he saw the video the night before, he knew things had gone too far. He had spent the whole night thinking about what to do. As a senior police officer, he had always believed in fairness and dignity. And now, two of his own colleagues had treated his mother with neither. He sat at his desk in silence, staring at the uniform hanging on the wall. The badge that once filled him with pride now felt heavier than ever. He took a deep breath and opened his phone again. The video had gathered millions of views and the comments were flooding in. People were demanding action, asking who the officers were and calling for justice. He scrolled through the comments, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. He wasn't angry only because it was his mother. He was angry because this incident showed how far some people had drifted from humanity. Called the department and asked to meet the officers who had been on ticket inspection duty the previous day. His tone was calm but firm. The officers, not knowing what was coming, agreed to meet at the station later in the day. He didn't tell them why. Meanwhile, across the city, reporters were already digging for information. News anchors discussed the story, replaying the clip again and again. One channel called it a reflection of society's lost empathy. Another invited guests to debate the role of compassion in public service. The story had become more than just a moment on a bus. It had turned into a national conversation. Back at home, the old woman made tea as usual. She moved slowly, humming softly to herself. She didn't want to think about the bus, but she couldn't ignore the strange calls she was getting. Neighbors, relatives, and even strangers had started checking in on her. Some had seen her face online and recognized her. She didn't understand how her simple mistake had become a headline. When her son arrived home, she smiled weakly. "You look tired," she said gently. "Did you eat anything?" He shook his head, sitting beside her. "Mother, do you know people are talking about you everywhere?" She frowned. "About me? Why?" he sighed. "Someone recorded what happened on the bus. It's all over the internet." Her eyes widened. "Oh no, I didn't want that. I just wanted to go home." "Why would they do that?" "Because they wanted attention," he said quietly. "But now the truth is out there. Everyone can see how you were treated, and I can't stay silent about it." She reached for his hand, her fingers soft and wrinkled. "Please don't make trouble for anyone. Maybe they didn't mean it. It was just a bad day." He shook his head gently. "No, Mother. This isn't about revenge. It's about reminding people that kindness still matters. They need to understand what they did wrong, not just to you, but to everyone watching." She didn't argue. She knew how stubborn her son could be when he believed something was unjust. She only hoped he would handle it with wisdom. Later that afternoon, the officers involved in the bus incident were called to the central office. They arrived looking puzzled, whispering among themselves. The senior officer they were about to meet was known for his calm but commanding nature. They didn't expect this meeting to be about the bus, let alone that the woman in the video was his mother. When they entered his office, the air felt heavy. He sat behind his desk, hands folded, eyes steady. A tablet played the viral video on mute. The officers froze as they recognized the woman they had asked to step off the bus. "Do you remember this incident?" he asked quietly. They exchanged glances. One of them nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. It was a routine check. She didn't have a ticket. We followed procedure." He leaned back, his gaze sharp but calm. "Procedure? Tell me, did the procedure require you to forget compassion?" The younger officer looked nervous. "We didn't mean to disrespect her, sir. We were just doing our job." "Your job," he repeated softly. "Do you know who that woman is?" They hesitated. One of them spoke. "No, sir. Just a passenger." He turned the tablet toward them and tapped the screen, freezing the image of the woman standing at the bus door, tears in her eyes. "That passenger is my mother." The room went silent. Both officers went pale. The younger one swallowed hard, unable to speak. The older one tried to apologize, his voice trembling. "Sir, we didn't know. We never meant to." He raised a hand, stopping him. "That's exactly the problem. You didn't know. You didn't care to know. You saw an old woman and forgot she was a person. You forgot that behind every face there is a story." Neither of them could respond. The senior officer stood up, his voice steady but full of emotion. "You wear this uniform to serve, not to scare. The law gives you power, but without empathy that power becomes cruel. My mother didn't need special treatment because she's my mother. She deserved respect because she's human." The officers lowered their heads. Guilt filled the room. He took a deep breath and continued. "You will both write a full report on what happened. Then you'll spend the next few weeks volunteering at a senior care center. Maybe when you serve tea to someone who reminds you of her, you'll understand what you forgot that day." They nodded quickly, both relieved and ashamed. As they left, the senior officer sank back into his chair. He wasn't angry anymore, just sad. Sad that such a moment had to happen for people to see what humanity truly means. That evening, he visited his mother again. She was sitting by the window knitting quietly. He told her everything, about the officers, about the apology, about how the story had reached people all over the country. She listened silently, her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want them punished," she whispered. "They're not being punished," he said softly. "They're being reminded. Sometimes we all need reminding." She nodded, touched by his words. "You did the right thing. But promise me something. Don't let anger guide you. Let kindness lead instead." He smiled faintly. "That's something you taught me, remember?" She chuckled softly, the sound gentle and warm. For the first time since the bus incident, she felt peace return to her heart. The next day, the news broke that the officers involved had been disciplined and reassigned to community service. The announcement sparked mixed reactions. Some praised the decision, calling it a lesson in humility. Others debated it, arguing whether emotions should play a role in law enforcement. But among all the noise, one truth stood clear. The story had touched millions. People began sharing their own experiences, moments when they were ignored, humiliated, or helped by strangers. Messages poured in from across the country, thanking the old woman for reminding everyone what compassion looks like. Back at her home, she received dozens of letters and flowers from strangers she'd never met. Some called her brave. Some said she gave them hope. She read each one slowly, smiling softly. She didn't think of herself as brave. She had only been herself, kind, gentle, and forgiving. Her son watched her quietly from the doorway. He felt proud, not because people were talking about her, but because even through humiliation she had chosen grace. The world had seen her pain, but now they were seeing her strength too. That night, as the city lights flickered outside, the old woman sat by the window again, sipping tea. She whispered a small prayer for everyone, for the ones who had hurt her, for the ones who had defended her, and for those who had learned from her story. The world might have forgotten kindness for a moment, but she believed it could always remember again, and somewhere deep inside, her son knew that this was only the beginning of something greater, a change that started with one woman, one bus, and one lesson the world would never forget. The story of the elderly woman and the bus incident didn't fade away quickly. Days turned into a week and the video continued to circulate online. News stations replayed it, social media users discussed it endlessly, and more people began to share their own encounters with moments of public humiliation or kindness. The old woman, who had once been just another face in the crowd, had unknowingly become a symbol of human dignity. Her son watched it all quietly from a distance. He had done what he could to address the matter within the department, and the officers had begun their community service. But even now, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to do. It wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about the message her experience carried. He had seen firsthand how people could lose their sense of compassion while following orders or routines. He wanted to change that, even if only in small ways. Every morning he would visit his mother before going to work. She always greeted him with a smile, pretending everything was back to normal. She didn't like the attention she was getting, especially when strangers stopped her on the street to thank her or express sympathy. She was humble and didn't see herself as a hero. She only wanted peace. One morning, she sat at the kitchen table reading a newspaper. Her eyes landed on a photo of herself from the viral video. The headline read, "Elderly Woman's Humiliation Sparks a National Conversation." She sighed, folding the paper. When her son entered the room, she smiled faintly and said, "I never thought my bus ride would make it to the newspaper." He smiled softly. "Maybe that's how life works sometimes. The smallest things can wake people up," she nodded. "I just hope it wakes them up kindly." They both sat quietly for a while, the sound of distant traffic blending with the chirping of birds. The city was alive, but in that moment, everything felt still and peaceful. Elsewhere, the officers who had been involved continued their community service. At first, they treated it as just another task, but as the days passed, something inside them began to change. Working with elderly people, listening to their stories, helping them with small chores, they started to understand the meaning of humility. They learned patience, compassion, and the quiet dignity that comes with age. One day, one of them wrote a letter to the senior officer. It said, "Sir, I can never undo what happened, but I've learned something valuable. When we serve people, we're not just enforcing rules, we're shaping trust. Thank you for showing me that." The officer read the letter silently, a faint smile forming on his face. He folded it neatly and placed it in his drawer. That letter meant more to him than any award or recognition. It was proof that real change had started. As weeks turned into months, life began to settle down again. The old woman's story stopped trending online, replaced by new headlines. But the people who had seen it never truly forgot. Every time someone offered a seat to an elderly passenger or helped a stranger on the street, her quiet influence lived on. One afternoon, while walking to the nearby park, the old woman noticed a bus stopped at the corner. The driver stepped down and helped an older man with his groceries. She watched from a distance, smiling to herself. Maybe the world wasn't so cold after all. When she returned home, her son called to check on her. They talked about simple things: dinner, the weather, plans for the weekend. Before hanging up, he said softly, "Mother, I'm proud of you." She smiled, her heart full. "And I'm proud of you too. You turned pain into something good. That's not easy." That night, she prayed quietly, not for herself, but for everyone, to never lose their humanity, no matter how fast life moved. Because sometimes it takes one act of cruelty to awaken 1,000 acts of kindness. And though her story had started on a crowded bus, it ended in a place of warmth and hope, where compassion found its way back into people's hearts. The next morning started like any other day in the police headquarters, but there was tension in the air that no one could ignore. The officers who were involved in the bus incident sat silently at their desks, replaying the video that had gone viral overnight. Each of them hoped it would fade away soon, that people would forget, but the truth was spreading faster than they imagined. The story of the elderly woman being forced off the bus had touched millions of hearts, and everyone wanted answers. Inside the senior officer's office, the atmosphere was heavy. He sat behind his desk, eyes fixed on the paused video showing his mother being helped off the bus by a stranger. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This wasn't just a random case, it was personal. The woman humiliated in front of everyone was the same person who had raised him with patience and love, who had taught him to respect every human being regardless of their status. Seeing her treated that way made his chest tighten. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. He wasn't just angry, he was disappointed. Disappointed that his own team could act with such coldness. He knew he had to handle the situation with balance. If he let emotions take over, he might lose control. But if he stayed silent, he would lose the very values his mother had instilled in him. A knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. One of his assistants entered and hesitated before speaking. "Sir, the officers involved in the bus incident are waiting outside. Should I send them in?" The senior officer nodded slowly. "Yes, bring them in." Moments later, 3 officers stepped into the room, their faces pale. None of them could meet his eyes. They stood in a straight line, hands behind their backs, as if hoping to blend into the background. The silence was thick, and the sound of the clock ticking made the tension even worse. He looked at them for a long moment before speaking. "Do any of you know who the woman in this video is?" He asked quietly, pressing play. The video began to roll again, showing his mother clutching her purse, trembling as she tried to explain herself to the officers. One of them swallowed hard. "Sir, we don't know her personally. We were just following protocol." "Following protocol?" His voice was calm but sharp. "Do you think protocol gives you the right to treat someone like this?" They stayed silent. Not one of them dared to speak. He paused the video again, his voice steady but full of emotion. "That woman," he said, pointing to the screen, "is my mother." The words hit them like a thunderclap. One of the officers took a step back, his mouth slightly open. Another's face turned red, and the youngest looked as if he might faint. None of them had expected this. The room felt smaller now, the weight of guilt pressing down on them. "She didn't tell anyone who her son was." He continued quietly. "She didn't use my name to get special treatment. She didn't need to. All she deserved was basic respect. But instead she was humiliated in public. You made her feel small for something that could have been solved with kindness." The oldest of the 3 officers spoke softly, almost whispering. "Sir, we truly didn't mean to cause harm. We thought she was avoiding paying the fare. We were just doing our job. He leaned forward, his eyes steady. Doing your job doesn't mean forgetting your humanity. When someone is old, struggling, or frightened, your first duty isn't to enforce rules, it's to understand. The words hung in the air. The officers lowered their heads, unable to meet his gaze. The silence stretched again until he finally stood up. You wear this uniform not to show power, but to protect. My mother didn't need your punishment. She needed your help. If she had fallen while being forced off that bus, would that have still been procedure? None of them answered. He took a deep breath, walking to the window. The city outside was busy as usual, people rushing to work, buses moving through traffic, horns honking. It was a normal day out there, but for him, nothing felt normal anymore. After a long pause, he turned back to them. You'll be suspended for the week, he said firmly. After that, you'll report to community service. You'll spend time with elderly citizens, help them, talk to them, understand them. Maybe then you'll learn what real duty means. The officers nodded silently, accepting the decision. As they left the room, he sank back into his chair, feeling both drained and relieved. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about change. Later that day, he visited his mother. She was sitting in her small living room, quietly knitting, as if the world hadn't been talking about her all night. When she saw him, her face lit up with a gentle smile. You came early today, she said softly. He sat beside her, taking her hand. I saw the video, Mother. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. She looked at him kindly, shaking her head. Don't be sorry, my son. Those men didn't know. They were just doing what they thought was right. He sighed deeply. Still, it shouldn't have happened. You deserved better. She smiled faintly. I'm just glad someone helped me that day. Not everyone turns away. There's still kindness out there. He looked at her with admiration. Despite everything, she wasn't bitter. Her heart remained gentle and forgiving. It reminded him why he respected her so deeply, and why he became who he was. Before leaving, he promised her that he would make sure the situation turned into something meaningful. This won't just be a story people forget, he said. It will be a lesson. Over the next few days, the story continued to spread. News channels reported the twist that shocked everyone. The elderly woman in the viral video was the mother of a high-ranking officer. The public was surprised and opinions flooded in. Some felt ashamed they hadn't spoken up on the bus. Others praised the officer for how he handled the issue. The bus company issued an apology, promising better training for its staff. The police department released a statement emphasizing respect, empathy, and understanding. Across the city, people began talking about how small acts of kindness could change everything. One day, while walking through the station, the senior officer overheard two young recruits talking about the incident. That video really opened my eyes, one said. I used to think being tough meant being right, but now I see it's the opposite. The officer smiled faintly as he walked past. The lesson was already spreading. Meanwhile, his mother continued her quiet life. Sometimes neighbors stopped by with flowers or groceries, offering help or just to say hello. She would smile politely and tell them she didn't need much, only good company. Despite all the attention, she stayed humble, as she had always been. The incident that once embarrassed her had now turned into something powerful, a reminder for everyone that respect doesn't depend on who someone is, but on who we choose to be. Days later, when the senior officer returned home after a long day, he found his mother sitting by the window again, watching the sunset. He sat beside her silently, the sky glowing in shades of orange and gold. You know, she said softly, sometimes bad things happen, so good lessons can grow. He looked at her and smiled. You're right, Mother. Maybe this was one of those times. The two of them sat quietly as the day faded away, both at peace knowing that out of one painful moment, something good had begun. The world had seen the story and hopefully it would remember. Later that day at the police headquarters, the senior officer held a meeting with his team. He had prepared something unusual, a session about compassion in service. The room was full of officers, young and old, all curious about why they were gathered. He stood at the front, his expression calm but thoughtful. He began, We wear this uniform to protect, but protection doesn't only mean stopping crime. Sometimes it means showing kindness when no one else does. The room stayed silent as he spoke. He didn't mention his mother by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. An old woman on a bus doesn't seem like a big story, he continued. But look at how it touched the world. People didn't react because of the law. They reacted because they saw humanity. He paused, letting the words sink in. That's what we're missing sometimes. We're so focused on being right that we forget to be kind. The officers listened quietly, some nodding, others looking down in thought. He ended the meeting with a simple message. The world is watching us, but more importantly, it's feeling us. Every act of kindness or cruelty leaves a mark. When the session ended, a few officers approached him to thank him. One of them said softly, "Sir, I saw that video before I even knew it was your mother. It made me think about my own grandmother." "I'll never forget it," he smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. That's all he wanted. To remind them that the badge on their chest carried both power and responsibility. Meanwhile, the woman's life had slowly returned to its gentle rhythm. She spent her mornings watering the small plants on her balcony, and her afternoons knitting or reading old letters. Every so often, someone would knock on her door, a neighbor bringing flowers, a journalist asking for an interview, or even strangers wanting to thank her in person. She always welcomed them politely but never sought the spotlight. One afternoon, a young woman from a local community center visited her. She introduced herself kindly and said, "We're organizing an event about empathy and respect. Would you come and speak for a few minutes? People would love to hear from you." The old woman looked hesitant. "Oh, I'm not good with big crowds. I wouldn't know what to say." The young woman smiled. "You don't need to prepare anything. Just speak from your heart. You already taught people something powerful, just by being yourself." After a moment, she nodded slowly. "All right, I'll come." When the day of the event arrived, the small hall was filled with people of all ages. There were students, teachers, officers, and ordinary citizens. The senior officer quietly sat in the back, proud but unnoticed. When it was her turn to speak, the elderly woman walked slowly to the microphone, her hands trembling slightly. She looked at the crowd, then smiled gently. "I'm not here to talk about rules or justice," she began softly. "I'm just here to talk about kindness. That day on the bus, I wasn't angry. I was just sad. Not because I lost my ticket, but because I felt invisible. Sometimes that's the hardest thing in this world, to feel like no one sees you." The room was silent. Her words carried weight, not loud or dramatic, but real. She continued, "We all have bad days. The officers that day, they were just doing their job. Maybe they didn't realize how their tone or their actions could make someone feel. We all make mistakes. What matters is learning from them." A few people wiped their eyes as she spoke. She smiled softly and said, "If one person here remembers to be kind when it's hardest, then all this noise, all this attention, it's worth it." When she finished, the audience stood and applauded warmly. Her son watched her from the back of the room, his eyes filled with emotion. She didn't know it, but that moment had just inspired hundreds of people more deeply than any speech could. After the event, reporters approached her for interviews, but she simply smiled and said, "There's nothing more to say. Just be kind." She left quietly with her son, avoiding the cameras. In the following weeks, the community center received countless messages from people sharing how the story had changed them. One bus driver wrote, "Now I make sure to greet every passenger with a smile, no matter how tired I am." A young student shared, "I helped an old man carry his groceries today because I remembered that lady from the bus." Small changes began to appear everywhere, proof that her quiet strength had left a real impact. At home, the old woman went back to her peaceful life. She liked keeping things simple, watering her plants, cooking her favorite meals, and occasionally visiting her friends. Every now and then, her son would stop by and bring her flowers. They didn't talk much about the incident anymore. It had become part of the past, though its lessons still lingered. One evening, as they sat on the balcony watching the sunset, she said softly, "You know, I never wanted any of this attention, but maybe it happened for a reason." Her son looked at her curiously. "What reason?" She smiled. "So people could remember what kindness looks like. Sometimes the world needs reminders." He nodded, admiring her wisdom. "You're right, Mother. And maybe that's why it happened to you, because you were strong enough to handle it." She laughed gently. "Strong? Oh, I don't know about that. I just tried not to lose my heart." The days that followed brought quiet change across the city. The story of the elderly woman forced off the bus was no longer just a trending topic. It had become a lesson everyone was talking about. People were sharing their own experiences, confessing moments when they had looked away instead of helping. For the first time in a long while, the city seemed to pause and reflect on what kindness really meant. The senior officer went back to his usual routine, but things didn't feel the same. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Some approached him with gratitude, others with apologies, saying how the story had changed the way they saw others. He appreciated their words, but he didn't let them inflate his pride. What mattered most to him was that something good had come out of his mother's painful experience. At home, his mother's days had also changed slightly. Neighbors who once walked past her without notice now stopped to greet her warmly. The grocer near her apartment refused to take payment sometimes, insisting that she had brought something positive to the community. She would laugh and tell him she didn't do anything special, but he would always smile and say, "You reminded us what respect looks like." She remained humble, never seeing herself as a symbol or hero. In her mind, she was just an old woman who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But deep down, she hoped the officers who had treated her harshly learned something valuable. A few weeks later, the senior officer received an update from the community program he had assigned to those officers. They had been spending their days helping at elderly centers, assisting with grocery deliveries, and organizing social activities for senior citizens. He was told that their attitude had changed drastically. They no longer saw those tasks as punishment. They had started to genuinely care. He decided to visit them quietly one afternoon. When he arrived at the community hall, he saw one of the officers helping an elderly man fix a broken walking stick, while another arranged chairs for a storytelling session. The youngest one was listening intently to an old woman sharing memories from her youth. There was laughter in the air, and the atmosphere felt warm and human. He didn't announce his presence immediately. Instead, he stood at the doorway watching for a while. It gave him peace to see how the lesson had taken root. Only after a few minutes did the officers notice him. They hurried over, nervous but respectful. "Sir," one of them said quietly, "we've learned a lot. Thank you for giving us a second chance," he nodded. "I'm not the one you should thank. Thank the people who let you learn, especially those you once ignored." They understood. It wasn't about forgiveness, it was about change. And they had changed. Later that evening, as he returned home, he told his mother about what he had seen. She smiled softly. "That makes me happy," she said. "Sometimes people just need a reason to see the world differently." He looked at her lovingly. "You gave them that reason," she laughed gently. "No, my dear, life did. Life has a way of teaching us all in its own time." Over the next few days, letters began arriving at the police department from people all over the country. Some were from elderly citizens thanking the officer's mother for her quiet strength. Others were from parents who said they showed the story to their children to teach them about compassion. A few letters were handwritten, filled with emotional words from people who said they would never forget what happened. One letter in particular stood out. It came from a woman in a distant town. She wrote that after seeing the video, she decided to step in when she saw a similar situation on her local bus. "Your story gave me the courage to act," the letter said. "I couldn't stay silent anymore." When the officer read it aloud to his mother, she had tears in her eyes. "That's the best outcome," she whispered. Someone found their voice. A few months later, a small ceremony was held at the community hall. The police department wanted to formally acknowledge the changes made within the team and honor those who had inspired the transformation. The elderly woman was invited as a guest of honor. She didn't expect it and felt nervous about the attention, but her son encouraged her gently. "You don't have to make a speech," he said. "Just be yourself. That's enough."